So if Coughlin joins, I guess he'll join. But so starting with this, it's a culminating project for the school to be able to help improve pretty much. Yeah. So it's improving the school with the culminating project. So just a little bit of agenda before we start. Looking at this, it's we're going to be looking at the school information, then data supporting the reason for the improvement plan that went along with this, with the instruction that helped it out, and then the description of the project, and then the professional development that was put in place to be able to help support and implement it, and then the timeline of it that was followed along with it throughout the entire time. So this was something that was already kind of put into place, really, and went out through the school year. If you ended up hearing about it, it was done with the school to kind of help with the different reading scores, especially with the minority demographics, to be able to help out with those students as well, um, throughout the entire process of the school year, especially with the different implementations that we had, with the different programs. Such as Lexia and pretty much the student-led conferences that we ended up doing with the seventh grade, and stuff like that. So first off, starting out with the school information. Obviously, you all work here, so you know quite a bit about it. But first one being school enrollment. The enrollment officially, based on at the beginning of this year, was 1,041 students. Was the overall student enrollment. Obviously, it teaches grades 6 through 8, and it has a 58% minority enrollment, and that was kind of the process of thinking was the struggling of them, to be able to help improve those students with the minority enrollment. And the magnet program ends up pushing a lot of students that aren't necessarily their homeschool for it. And then the student to teacher ratio is about an 18 to 1 student teacher ratio for the school. So a couple of the data that ended up helping support the proposal that we ended up going for, that I ended up doing throughout this project, of kind of helping out with the reading scores to try to improve those with the minority demographics. If we look at this, so this is from the fall of 2024, based on the map scores that we had. This one's for the math. Obviously, we targeted reading mostly, but with the math reading scores from fall 2024, 59% of the students were below the 50th percentile, which obviously that's something that you would want to improve in your school if a lot of the students are below the 50th percentile of it. As you can see, about 31% were in the first to 20th, which is the lower half, the lowest of the low. The 21 to the 40th percentile, about 25, 27% of those students were in that. And then about 22% were in about the middle area, the 41 to 60th. And then this is where it really starts to drop. Only about 13% were in the 61st to 80th. And then overall, about 5% were in the 80th to 100. So overall, math, where that's not really what we're targeting, but it kind of goes along with that, with it as a whole, with the entire group as well. So this is more the area that we're looking at mostly is the reading map scores, throughout this. So with the reading map scores from the fall, this is where we started at from the beginning of it. Now you'll see here in a little bit that it didn't really make the strides that we were hoping for, but it did end up improving the reading scores a little bit with what we implemented, and it started kind of getting it going in the right direction. But mostly the scores for the fall of 2024 before we started, or before I started, was 46% of students, and percent of them were below the 50th percentile. So looking at it, about 22% were in the lowest group, the first to 20th percentile. About 25, which was by far the most percent of students, were in the 21st to 40th percentile. And then the middle group had quite a few too. In the middle and then the middle high were the 41st and 60th percentile, were about in the 23%. And then the 61st to 80th percentile, we're in about the middle 23%. And then we also had the lower group. The lowest of the low was the distinguished, the group that was only about at 10%. It was at 80th to 100 group. You know, this was kind of the main factor that kind of opened my eyes of the groups that we could kind of push forward and help out throughout this process. And the main process of it was not only helping them out in reading, but helping them out with and being able to implement that in other subjects such as social studies. Um, and we could even do that in science and especially with how social studies being kind of pushed, it's kind of being changed more to a reading and data analysis type course instead of the classic type course that we're used to, or is like remember these facts and dates. Um, so it's kind of getting moved towards that analysis group. So it really goes hand in hand with the reading strategies to be able to help implement those in social studies and so that they can just see it more often throughout all their classes and even in other classes during Genius Hour and that type of things like that. So on this next slide, it's more of where we were now. So this is the spring map scores based on the math reading scores from spring 2025. 54% of students are in the below the 50th percentile. So that is a little bit lower than what it was. So first to 20th, this is obviously math, so we don't have to look at it too in depth wise, but you still would like to know it based on the entire school. So first to 20th, it's at about 33%. 21st to 40th, it's at about 25, 26%. 41st to 60th, it's at about 20%. And then 61st to 80th, it's at about, a little bit over 12%. And then 81st to 100th is a little bit at about 8%. So, it's starting to move towards the right direction. The eighth grade has definitely improved since their time in here, especially as the whole school. So, as you can see from when they go to sixth grade and start to move up, they do improve um, pretty much drastically, especially in math. But reading was kind of the area where they were a little bit struggling a little bit, but the numbers have gotten better. It was 46%. And then based on the spring scores that we have, 45% of the students are below the 50th percentile compared to 46 from when we started in the fall at the beginning of the school year. So looking at it, you can see it there, 25th, 25% at first to 20th, 20th is at 21st to 40th. So you've seen those gains, especially the lowest group has gone down compared to this one has gone down a little bit, and then the higher group has gotten a little bit up. So you're kind of looking to improve those guys just one at a time, and just hopefully get those percentages, down from where they're below the 50th percentile a little bit. So we've achieved that by implementing this and using it 1% at a time. And it's just down that 1% than what it was earlier in the school year. So hopefully, if we continue to be able to implement this throughout next school year and be able to use this as it continues, hopefully the data does end up benefiting us and going in our favor a little bit more and continues to go down with the students being below the 50th percentile as they were. So this is the KSA score. So obviously we don't have the up-to-date ones for this year because they're currently taking KSA this week. But looking at it, if you look at this where we started at and kind of the numbers that made us kind of decide this project and go towards this project of helping out with reading and improving it and social studies as well to kind of help those two areas. If you look at the novice scores, which is the lowest, um, the social studies is by far the highest novice grade, so we're looking to improve that. And then reading is 37% novice. So that's not as bad, but we're still looking to improve it. And if once we get to the demographics of the KSA scores, of the different groups, you'll see why it's kind of mainly African American focus and the different minority groupings focus on the reading. So looking at it as well, social studies continues. It is the second distinguished highest, but it's the lowest novice. So it's really that middle group is kind of where they are, that middle to lower. And there's no really in between where they're at. They're either novice, they're distinguished. There's really no proficient looking at it. It's mostly one of those two, with it being the highest and the lowest. And if you're looking at reading and writing, especially writing, the distinguished, they only got 1%. So this kind of goes in with the reading and writing, with them being able to analyze data and understand the different, analysis of what they're reading. They can pull out different aspects of it and different information from it to be able to use that in their writing, that they would have to be able to advance their skills, not only with writing and reading, but also social studies, science, all that, to be able to use this in every single subject. So that's kind of the KSA scores that we were looking at. Obviously, hopefully they go up based on the ones that we have this year. And then looking at the demographics of it, of the social studies scores, with it, this is the social studies demographics. As we can see, we have the Hispanic, African Americans actually weren't available for the social studies one, for the groups that I ended up getting sent. But the Hispanic and minority group for the Hispanic is the highest novice percentile. Apprentice isn't very good, but and then the distinguished is obviously low. So looking at the different demographics for reading as well, this is where we kind of get into the African American minority being the lowest out of all of them. So if you're looking at these two, um, the Asian population of the school and the student body is the highest. So if you're looking at the lowest is African American with only a 50% novice rating, 30% apprentice, 16% proficient, and 3% distinguished, especially the distinguished rating. It's a lot lower than all the other ones. So that's really kind of the main group that we're kind of looking at is the minority grouping. And with what we did, putting them in the Genius Hour classes, to be able to kind of separate them from their lower level students with the higher level students and kind of keep them and build them on the same track, being in their classes. That kind of helped out with this. Using Lexia and Genius Hour, which is what a lot of the classes are doing, using Lexia to pretty much help them be able to build upon themselves, helping out with the different reading strategies, especially SQ3R, using that in social studies to be able to use as another reading strategy for whenever they're taking the KSA test and they're doing their writing, on demand, or they're doing their reading where they have to end up writing a paragraph or two for one of the response questions that they're taking currently. This kind of helps them out to be able to be more familiar with it. And as they're writing in social studies and using that SQ3R, that, three facts to be able to build upon, and kind of using it almost like a 3 by 5 essay when they're writing, especially pulling out evidence from their readings. And it kind of helps them out and be able to get used to that in the practice. And hopefully, those would eventually be able to move their scores in the reading category. Because as I've seen today, whenever I'm looking at most of the KSA, it's most of the students taking it and then writing, um, shorter paragraphs and being able to understand how they know what to write and what to put in there. That's the most main topics from the story that they're reading. So that was kind of really the main focus of it. This was a question I had, but that's kind of something we talked about, so I'm gonna skip over it. And then another point of the data that I ended up choosing was to try to help out the minority students with the reading was going off our CSIP goal. So the school, if you don't know, obviously has a CSIP that they end up making every single year to be able to be their main focus of what they're trying to improve and the main goals that they're trying to make. So the main goals of our CSIP at Farnsley was to improve the ECE achievement for both reading and map scores. So mainly the reading as well. So our ECE students are very low compared to our other ones and other ECE students in the district. So those ones that have the accommodations, making sure that they are improving with those classes that they're being able to be put in with the Genius Hour and the Lexia programs that they're ended up adding. And then here's one of the quotes from our CSIP, that ends up helping, kind of follow this along with the main goal of the school is our objectives is to increase the achievements for the students identified as ECE for both the reading and math, since it is our largest gap while still focusing on student identified as ELL, African Americans, and Hispanic. So really trying to figure out why we're not connecting with those ECE students in these different areas, especially on the map scores, not being able to see that growth, which if we look at it as we did from the fall to the spring, with the since this has been implemented, we are a little bit starting to see the growth amongst those students, in that EC category. But that's kind of the main goal, and this goes in with not only EC students, but as it says they're still identifying with the ELL, African American and Hispanic, being able to see that with the different social studies topics that we end up talking about during this time, being able to talk about West African trade, different Black History Month stuff, and then, different areas of the world and time period that we talk about in social studies during seventh grade. And the overall main goal of it was to cut down racial disparities and other demographic groups or gaps. So as we've seen in those, there's different gaps amongst the demographics, especially at the African Americans being the lower point, as we've seen in that chart. So trying to figure out how to cut down on that with the different reading strategies and implementing them with those, and being able to just be able to improve overall and not have that different demographic gap that we currently have in the school. And over this past year, with us implementing the professional developments, all the different strategies, stuff like that, we're hopefully getting that group and the demographic racial group in the right direction. So description of the project I ended up doing throughout this year overall. This maybe should have been in the beginning, but here we are towards the end of it after looking at all the data for it. I was targeting and raising the reading scores for all students, not I originally wanted to end up focusing on the African American demographic group, but overall, I just ended up going with the entire students as it ended up changing. And originally, it was only going to be social studies students, and it ended up changing over time to where it was pretty much the whole seventh grade floor that was in on it, using the different programs and using the different strategies for every subject. And that helped ended up building the students to be able to using these in every subject, getting familiar with them, and they're able to use them constantly to where it's able to improve their scores that we'll be able to see. And then this was the original focus was to be implemented on all students. And although it will have a focus on African American students, that was usually the main goal, although it kind of did end up shying away from African American students and not going as much with it. And then it will research and decide best strategies to impact on students. So using this, we looked at the different reading strategies, the different programs that we did end up implementing, and seeing which ones were the most effective. And with those being the most effective was like the SQ3R strategy that we ended up using, the through reasoning. The Lexia programming that we ended up using to be able to implement in there. Lexia was actually a big part of our implementation and project here because since we were able to improve that, it kind of gave the students and put them on a level that they're at and then help them improve based on different texts that it ends up pulling for them to be able to read and work throughout the entire year for their Genius Hour class, which was their first period. They ended up using that and being able to improve on top of that, as along with using those different strategies in their core main for social studies, science, math, and English mainly using those in those classes to be able to help um, pretty much improve them with being able to read and write. Because sometimes you get a student and sometimes they even struggle just to read the text. So hopefully being able to have them pull out the different context clues, being able to figure out what's important with the text, what the evidence based is, to be able to help them out to be able to improve their reading strategies and then inform and implement these with other social studies teachers. This it did end up changing. Originally, we started to do the social studies teachers, but we didn't use all of them. So it kind of ended up becoming more of like a seventh grade project. So we were able to implement different things in the seventh grade, and it was mostly all the seventh grade teachers. We were using Lexia, the SQ3R reading strategies in our classroom. Also being able to use that and print out the data for the students to be able to see with how they're going to be able to improve. With the student-led conference that we ended up doing, we ended up having a student-led conference where the student got all their data from Lexia, from the map reports, from everything, and then they were able to take that home to their parents and identify what area that they're growing in and what area they're doing well in, and how they were going to do that and how they were going to continue that throughout the rest of the school year and even into next year. And they would end up getting that signed and taken home, and bringing it back to us to be able to share with their parents that, hey, they're committed to this and they're going to be growing on this. And then overall at the end, gathering data and evidence to see how it affected the students. As we've seen, we ended up doing checks periodically with different formative assessments throughout each PLC in each grade level, each subject. we ended up using CFAs, which are the common formative assessments for the social studies and the other subjects as well, to be able to pull together to see if it is benefiting the students and they are growing. And overall, since we looked at the data and analyzed all the data, they were growing and doing a lot better. As we can see, even there, we in the 50th percentile, even though it's only 1%, that's 1% that's doing better than where they were when we started this. And we look to hopefully improve that and keep that going as we end up implementing this and continuing this into the next year. And then I believe this is towards the end, the professional development. Overall, what the professional development was being able to these main points and present it to the teachers to hopefully get more buy-in and to be able to help them out with this. So overall, presented the overall goal and what we are trying to accomplish. So what is the purpose of this? Showing them the data. Why are we doing this? So that hopefully would create more buy-in by doing that and giving them an actual reason instead of just telling them that we're doing this, to actually give them an understanding of how we're going to do it and that we have a plan and that's very organized and that's going to benefit the students and themselves, as teachers. And overall in the professional development, we modeled the reading strategies to implement in their classroom. So whenever I ended up presenting this, obviously one of the best ways to be able to present this to other teachers is to be able to actually model it and to be able to actually show them how it's going to work in the classroom. Because one of the worst things in professional development, whenever you are getting presented something, they don't really explain it very well and they don't go over it as much. So it kind of just leaves you in the dark and you're like, I don't really want to use this. I don't know what I'm doing or how this is going to work. So I don't really want to implement this. That's kind of what we're trying to avoid by using the modeling tactic and to be able to model this for them during that professional development so they can get a full understanding of it. Discuss ways this is beneficial to them in the classroom. So why would this be able to be beneficial to them? How is it going to help them? How is it going to be able to make them a better teacher? How is it going to help the students? Stuff like that, be able to make it obviously, you know, more valuable to them so that they will actually have a reason and more of a, buy-in to be able to want to use it. And then lastly, gave them a look at Lexia and how to use it. Now, this is some in an area that I think is going to improve and be a lot better for next year. Because at the beginning, obviously, not a lot of people knew how to use it. It was new. No one had ever used it. So trying to kind of getting them familiar with it and to be able to help them out with it. And hopefully over time into next year, we can use it in better and different ways to be able to help out the students, help them grow, and use the reports that it gives us because it gives us a ton of data and reports on how they're doing each week, how much time they're using, what areas they're growing in, and how much more do they probably need to grow in that area, stuff like that. So it gives us all that data. So with us being more familiar with it and understanding more of it and how to use that data and how to see that data, it will definitely be able to help. All right. And oh, it's not letting. Okay. And then this was the timeline overall for it. Obviously, at the beginning, we ended up doing a lot of research to be able to help it out. You can kind of take a second and look at this. And it created a lot of surveys. Obviously, with the surveys, you want to be able to get the feedback from the teachers with how it's going and what they want to learn from it. So that was kind of the idea with a lot of the surveys. So then we can adjust it with how they are wanting to use it, and then conduct different professional developments throughout this time, to be able to make sure it's at its best. And we ended up presenting it and conducting it in January and then using it in the back half of the year so that they were able to use it, in the spring. So this is the second part. This is kind of the area where, we're kind of wrapping it up towards the end here. A lot of the social studies teachers, seventh grade teachers were able to use this. We ended up using CFAs, MAP, Lexia scores, different things like that to be able to help out with the data that this is improving our students and doing a better job of improving our students. And then overall, just it had a pretty good impact on it, and we ended up getting great feedback. I ended up getting great feedback from teachers that this is doing a good job throughout, helping the students with their reading struggles that they're having, to be able to actually improve them and guide them in the right direction to be able to make a change on how they're already acting in the school, with the different skills. So this also at the end there in May, discussing it, reflecting on it is what we're doing throughout this entire time to try to help out, with the students and to be able to make it better for next year. I mentioned it with Alexia. I think it's going to be make a greater impact throughout this entire time, and be able to use these strategies again next year with a better, more experienced group that have already used the strategies. It's just going to make the gains even better. And is there any questions about this at all? Okay. So no questions. I'm gonna go ahead. That's the sign in. I'm gonna end up sending it in the chat for all of you that ended up joining and ended up watching. You can sign your name and your contact information, and then I'm going to end up ending the recording.